Welcome to the first lecture for Section 4 of the class. Section 4 will end with Exam 4, which will be held finals week. Details about that will be posted on Blackboard. This chapter is about psychological disorders. In it, we'll talk about how disorders are identified, the criteria for them, and briefly, very briefly, go over a few disorders and their symptoms. All right, so let's start with the concept of abnormal behavior because psychological disorders are really a subset of abnormal behavior. Not all abnormal behavior is something that qualifies as a psychological disorder. But for those that do, we tend to use the medical model to understand these varieties of abnormal behavior as a disease. It wasn't always the case that this happened. In the 1600s in Salem, Mass, witchcraft was probably a better explanation for abnormal behavior rather than some type of paranoia or other kind of psychological disorder. People believe that psychological disorders, in the past, they've believed that they've been flaws of character, weaknesses of upbringing, or the result of demons, being possessed by demons. But in the last 200 years or so, we've come to see abnormal behavior as a disease, and this puts psychological disorders on par with medical disorders. It's an important conception because it implies that psychological disorders, like medical disorders, are treatable, and it also implies that the cause is identifiable. It means we can then engage in efforts of prevention. Notice it also doesn't say anything about the individual's character, whether they're weakness or demons possessing them. So let's talk generally about the causes of psychological disorders. We might be able to say with some medical disorders that we know that a collection of symptoms is due to a particular virus or a particular germ, but we cannot do that with psychological disorders. We cannot be that precise. But we do know that psychological disorders tend to have biopsychosocial underpinnings, and this is called the biopsychosocial model. For example, there may be genetics or brain structure, biological aspects of the individual that are that allow a psychological disorder to manifest itself. The psychological aspects might be attitudes one has or poor coping skills. The social aspects of the development of disorders could be poor relationships and stress resulting from those relationships or other environments in the person's life. But the biopsychosocial model says that all three of these categories of things are involved in causing disorders. This has led to people to see psychological disorders as following a diathesis stress model. The diathesis stress model says that individuals may have a predisposition for a disorder. Again, this is based upon also the medical model. Right? Someone may have a predisposition for lung cancer based upon their biological makeup or their place where they might work. But there's the diathesis stress model says for psychological disorders, there's some underlying predisposition for the disorder that is triggered by stress. So the diathesis is the predisposition, and some environmental experience is the trigger, some stress. Now, the stress does not need to be acute stress. It could be ongoing stress. It could be social stress. It could be psychological stress. But these two combinations is presumed to be underlying most disorders. So with a medical model, with say lung cancer, someone may have a predisposition for that disorder, but never undergo the environmental conditions that would lead to the disorder. For example, they may not smoke. They may not work in an industry where asbestos is involved. Right? They don't undergo those kinds of environmental conditions, so they don't develop disorder. Other people with less of a predisposition, or really more of a predisposition, right, maybe such a strong predisposition that they don't need much stress. Right, people who do not smoke sometimes develop lung cancer. So it's the interplay of the strength of the predisposition and the strength of the environmental events that may or may not bring about a psychological disorder. Before we go further, I want to talk some about the concept of insanity. Insanity is a legal term, not a psychological term, and it is the inability to understand right or wrong at the time of a crime. It is something used by defendants as a means of mitigating their guilt or responsibility for a crime. The view is that if someone is unable to understand right or wrong at the time of the crime, then perhaps the system should show them a little bit of consideration or mercy. But again, this is a legal term, not a psychological term. No one is diagnosed as insane. It's determined in court, right? A judge will make the finding. Now, the judge may rely upon the testimony of medical professionals or psychologists, but it is the evidence that those people present that allow the court to make the determination about whether someone understood right or wrong at the time the crime was committed. So with this legal standard, people with recognized disorders may be judged legally sane. Having a recognized disorder does not automatically make one insane in the eyes of the law. Conversely, right, someone with no disorder might be judged insane. The dimension of insanity is not correlated, is not related to the presence or absence of a recognized psychological disorder. Now, what's curious about the insanity defense is that it is very rarely used, and one study found that it was used in less than 1% of criminal felony cases, despite perception that it's much, much more common. Why do people think it's more common? Well, it makes for an interesting drama. Right? It's more often seen on Law and Order or courthouse dramas or legal dramas than it is in real life. So it's only used in less than 1% of criminal felony cases, and it is successful in only 1% of those. So it is very, very rare that someone is found not guilty by reason of insanity. That is an extremely rare occurrence and occurs much more in television and film than it does in real life. The classification of disorders has traditionally been done using the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The DSM, as it's known, is now in its fifth edition. And this fifth edition, DSM-5, came out in 2013. So it's been revised quite a bit. It doesn't get revised every year. It's every 5 to 10 years or so it tends to be revised. And the revisions are based upon research and the experience of clinicians. There are other classification disorders out there, but this is the one that traditionally has been the determinant as to whether someone has or does not have a psychological disorder. It's got 21 major categories that cover over 350 distinct disorders. The disorders are grouped into categories or families based upon the similarities of the symptoms. The criteria in the DSM are meant to be objective. They're meant to help a clinician diagnose a disorder. It's not meant to provide treatments or suggest treatments. It does not discuss possible causes. It is a guidebook by which a clinician, in interviewing an individual who comes to see them, can make a determination as to what exactly the cluster of symptoms and problems the person has, how it can be labeled. Now, the downside of labeling is clear, but there is an upside of labeling. By using common criteria, anyone who understands the DSM will understand what it means when someone says they've been diagnosed with anxiety. They will understand what it means if this individual goes to another doctor and says, I've been diagnosed with depression. Right? It facilitates communication and understanding. As an example of how the DSM works, here I'm going to show you the DSM-5 criteria for panic attack. This slide is also posted on Blackboard in the materials for Section 4 section of our class page. Panic attack is defined. It starts with a note defining things. Panic attack is an abrupt surge of intense fear or intense discomfort that reaches a peak within minutes, and during which time 4 or more of the following symptoms occur. The DSM-5 lists the criteria, lists the symptoms, and it's usually something like a check mark, a checklist. And in this case, someone has to experience 4 or more of the symptoms that will be listed here in a bit. Now, this isn't really for use by anybody. It takes training to use the DSM because you need to understand the language and understand the terms of what's being discussed in these symptoms. One symptom is palpitation, pounding heart, accelerated heart rate, sweating, trembling or shaking, sensations of shortness of breath or smothering, feeling of choking. Now notice most of these, of the first 5, 3 are physical symptoms: heart palpitation, sweating, and shaking. 4 and 5, choking and shortness of breath, could be probably are going to be perceived as physical symptoms, but notice this is a feeling of choking, not actually choking, or a sensation. So they're maybe a little bit more psychological. Chest pain or discomfort, nausea or abdominal distress, feeling of dizziness, feeling chills or heat sensations. Paresthesias is a feeling of numbness. Sometimes there's feelings of derealization or depersonalization. These are when someone feels it can't be happening, or they almost might feel like they're having an out-of-body kind of experience. They might fear losing control or going crazy, and they may have an intense fear of dying in that moment. To be diagnosed as a panic attack, right? Let's go back to the top. 4 or more of the following symptoms occur. That is the criteria for a panic attack. If someone has 5 or 6, they would be diagnosed as a panic attack. If they only have 2 or 3, well, the clinician isn't going to reject the person's experience, but they'll say, this maybe wasn't a panic attack, but it sure was close to a panic attack. And they would help the person work through whatever problems they have. It's not like the DSM is the little sign that you see when you go to Six Flags. It says you must be this tall to ride this ride. It is in the sense that you must have 4 of these symptoms to have a panic attack, but that doesn't mean you must have 4 of these symptoms for the clinician to be able to help the person with whatever brought them there in the first place. Prevalence of disorders. We go further. DSM, now that we kind of define things and gives people a label and a criteria for disorders, then we can start to count prevalence and say how many people meet these criteria. And in the United States, it's been found that 46.4% of the population will experience a disorder in their lifetime. That means nearly 50% will meet the criteria for a disorder in the DSM. Now that means, you do the math, 53.6 will not experience a disorder. Right? And this says over their lifetime. That's a long time. But what this tells us is that the DSM is indeed capturing the experiences of individuals, and that these experiences are not particularly rare. Another thing to consider, now that we can label things and know when they occur, is the idea of comorbidity. Comorbidity means that someone could have more than one diagnosed disorder. And of the 46% that experience a disorder in their lifetime, about 80% will experience a second disorder. Now, often these are co-occurring. The 2 disorders exist at the same time. The first category, the first family of of disorders I want to talk about is the anxiety disorders category. Um, these disorders are marked by excessive apprehension, nervousness, and worry that impairs normal functioning. And that bit there, impairs normal functioning, is an important thing to keep in mind. Everyone experiences anxiety. Everyone experiences worry. But when it impairs normal functioning, is when it becomes what we call maladaptive. That's when it becomes a problem for the individual. And that's generally the criteria by which the DSM exist, right? 4 out of the 5 for panic attacks, because when you get to of five, at least 4 of those things, when it becomes a real problem for the individual and their everyday functioning. So all the disorders in this group, in this category, tend to have this excessive worry as a characteristic. But as we'll see, it's expressed in different ways. In generalized anxiety disorder, the anxiety is sometimes called free floating. It doesn't attach to any particular object or thing. It just seems to kind of exist and is a constant in the individual's life. It's unrealistic anxiety. And that word unrealistic, right? You said some anxiety is normal and regular in one's life, right? People typically get anxious about exams and that motivates them to study. But unrealistic anxiety can be debilitating. Unrealistic is the anxiety is greater than the situation would demand. So someone becoming so anxious about an exam that they're physically sick or that they are unable to concentrate or study would move the anxiety from normal, regular anxiety to this unrealistic anxiety. And this unrealistic anxiety should last over 6 months. Right? There's always a time characteristic to the DSM. Now that's interesting, right? That says that someone can have some free-floating, unrealistic anxiety for a day or 3 days, perhaps a week, and that's not a disorder. That's common occurrence. Generalized anxiety disorder may involve physical problems such as heart palpitations or dizziness, and sometimes is even um, the person believes that they're having heart problems or a heart attack, and they'll go to a physician for EKGs or treatment for heart disorders, and they end up having no recognizable heart disorder. It's right often masked. Really, general anxiety disorders often mask in the individual's mind as a heart problem when really it is an anxiety issue. Panic disorder is recurring discrete episodes of what we called earlier the panic attacks. So panic attack is a single episode, and those are not that uncommon. But if panic attacks recur, it can lead to, it is a disorder in itself. In panic disorder, again, there's many physical symptoms such as chest pains, and panic disorder is often associated with what we call agoraphobia, which is a fear of public places. Agoraphobia doesn't mean the individuals are afraid of going out. They're afraid of being in public. And this happens often in panic disorder because the individuals are afraid of what's going to happen when they are out in public. This is an interview with an individual